What if I told you some of the most unthinkable royal stories were never really myths at all, just inconvenient facts that survived long enough to be called gossip? What if the nastiest rumours weren't invented to shock you, but to warn you? Tonight, we're walking through 30 British royal rumours that people whispered behind gloved hands, muttered in taverns, or printed with careful euphemisms, until time, documents, diaries, medical notes, court records, and plain old physics confirmed the grisly parts. Not all of these truths are tidy. Some are still disputed around the edges, but the core reality is often uglier than the polished portrait suggests. If you want more long-form British history made for sleep, background listening, and late-night curiosity, gently tap like, subscribe, and settle in. Now, draw the curtains, lower the lights, and let's begin with the kind of royal ending nobody could spin into poetry. Rumour 1. William the Conqueror's funeral turned into a biological incident. There's a particular kind of rumour that follows powerful men into the grave, not about their wars or laws, but about whether they could even manage a dignified death. With William the Conqueror, people repeated a story so grotesque it sounded like a medieval insult. His body supposedly burst during the funeral. The setup is already unpleasant. William died in 1087 after a campaign in Normandy, and contemporary accounts describe a death that was not gentle. Medieval embalming was limited, transport was slow, and bodies did what bodies do. By the time William's corpse was brought for burial at Caen, heat and time had been working steadily. The pivot is the moment ceremony meets reality. The funeral rites were underway, clergy solemn, nobles present, the entire thing staged to say, "This man conquered England and will be remembered with reverence." Except the coffin was reportedly too small, and in the process of forcing the swollen body into it, pressure did what pressure does. The rumour becomes a physical event. Chroniclers describe a sudden rupture, an eruption of putrid smell that drove people back, broke the mood, and turned a royal burial into a frantic scramble for fresh air. Whether every detail was remembered perfectly is impossible to prove, but the basic mechanics are painfully believable, and multiple accounts preserve the same humiliating theme. Even the conqueror couldn't conquer decay. The consequences were immediate and symbolic. A funeral is propaganda, especially for a dynasty still consolidating power. Instead, the message became, kings rot like everyone else, sometimes faster because everyone is too afraid to speak up about practicalities. And speaking of bodies that refused to behave the way royal image makers wanted, wait until you hear how a later king's appetite became the punchline of his own death. Rumour 2. Henry, I really did die after eating too many lampreys. Some royal rumours survive because they're too neat to forget. For Henry the Fern, the story people repeated was almost moralistic. The king ate something decadent, ignored sensible warnings, and paid for it with his life. The detail that made it stick was the food itself. Lampreys, those eel-like creatures that look as if they were designed by someone who disliked humanity. Henry thus died in 1135, and medieval writers were fascinated by the why, because a king's death always invites meaning. Lampreys were a luxury, the kind of dish associated with status and excess. And yes, accounts say Henry ate them, despite being advised against it. The rumour, in other words, wasn't merely that he died after dinner. It was that his indulgence was the cause. Here's the pivot. Modern readers sometimes assume this is pure folklore, like a fable about gluttony, but chroniclers close to the events record the lamprey meal as a significant factor, and the king's sudden illness afterward fits the pattern of severe food poisoning or an acute gastrointestinal crisis. We can't diagnose him across 9 centuries, and historians debate the precise medical chain. Yet the core claim, lampreys, a warning ignored, violent sickness, death shortly after, is documented strongly enough that it's more than a cute anecdote. The consequences were enormous. Henry's death without a widely accepted male heir helped tip England into a succession crisis, the period later known as the Anarchy. So this disgusting dinner rumour becomes, in hindsight, a hinge on which civil war swings. And speaking of power struggles, sometimes the filthiest rumours aren't about food at all, but about who shared a bed and what they were willing to do to keep it. Rumour 3. Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer were lovers, not just co-conspirators. When a queen helps overthrow her husband, people rarely assume the motive is purely political. With Isabella of France, wife of Edward II, Europe didn't just whisper that she'd turned against the king, it whispered that she'd replaced him. The setup begins with a court already poisoned by favouritism and faction. Edward II's reign was marked by intense resentment toward his chosen companions and advisers. Isabella, married young into a foreign court, watched her status erode as politics curdled around her. By the 1320s, she had become not only marginalised but dangerous, because a queen with a claim and a son is never merely a spouse. Then comes Roger Mortimer, a powerful marcher lord who became Edward II's enemy, and eventually Isabella's closest ally. The rumour was blunt. They were lovers. The more respectable version was that they were too familiar. The darker version was that their intimacy powered a coup. The pivot is that this isn't just spicy storytelling added later for drama. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts describe Isabella and Mortimer as closely associated, and their partnership after Edward's deposition was undeniably personal in its intensity. They ruled in the young Edward III's name, openly rewarding allies, punishing enemies, and behaving like two people who believed they would get away with it indefinitely. Evidence survives not as a single gotcha letter, but as a pattern. Their political unity, their shared household arrangements, the extraordinary access Mortimer had, and the way their enemies framed them. Because enemies always weaponize sex, but they weaponize it best when it's plausible. The consequences were brutal. Edward II was deposed in 1327, and while the exact details of his death remain debated, few historians doubt he was removed from the world permanently. Isabella's reputation calcified into something almost mythic. The she-wolf, the foreign queen, the adulteress. A misogynistic label, yes, but it clung because people sensed that the relationship, whatever its precise nature, had real power behind it. And speaking of a king surrounded by men who provoked obsession, hatred and whispers that wouldn't die, Edward II's own favourites are where the rumours turn from scandal to state crisis. Rumour 4. Edward II's favourites really did run the kingdom, and people really did loathe them for it. Some rumours don't need to be proven in a courtroom, because the paperwork of government itself gives them away. With Edward II's, the whisper was that he didn't merely enjoy the company of certain men, he elevated them so far above everyone else that the realm began to fracture. The setup is a young king inheriting a throne and immediately choosing companionship over consensus. Piers Gaveston was not born to be England's political centre of gravity, but under Edward, he became exactly that. He received titles and honours that made established nobles grind their teeth. Then, after Gaveston's fall and death, another set of names replaced him, most infamously Hugh Despenser the Younger, whose rise coincided with land seizures, harsh punishments, and a sense that the court had become a private club with a king-shaped doorman. The rumour people told was often sexual, because sex is an easy weapon. But the turned-out true part isn't that we can prove bedroom details, it's that the favouritism itself is undeniable. Records of grants, offices, legal advantages, and political decisions show these men accumulating power at a speed that alarmed everyone watching. Here's the pivot. Even if you strip away every salacious insinuation, the core disgust remains. The kingdom's machinery, justice, property, patronage, was bent around personal affection. It wasn't the love story people were angry about. It was the way love, or dependency, or obsession became policy. The consequences were predictable and violent. Opposition formed, rebellions flared, executions followed, and the king's authority became inseparable from the men nearest his ear. When the regime collapsed, it collapsed with a vengeance. Despenser's end in 1326 was so public and so vicious that it reads like a warning poster. This is what England does to men it believes have stolen the king. And speaking of rumours that get carved into the body itself, there's a later monarch whose physical deformity was treated as propaganda for centuries, until a skeleton quietly corrected the record. Rumour 5. Richard III really did have a crooked spine, just not the cartoon version. For generations, people repeated a Tudor-era image of Richard III as physically twisted, crooked-backed, malformed, a villain whose body supposedly advertised his soul. It's one of the oldest tricks in political storytelling. If you want the public to hate a ruler, describe him as unnatural. The setup is the aftermath of the Wars of the Roses, when the victorious Tudor dynasty needed the previous king to look illegitimate, monstrous, and safely dead. Plays, chronicles, and later retellings painted Richard as a kind of human omen. The rumour hardened into fact in popular imagination. He was deformed. Then the pivot arrived, not as a dramatic confession, but as archaeology. When Richard III's remains were identified centuries later, the bones didn't show a grotesque hunchback out of a morality play. They showed something more specific, more human, and ironically, more believable: scoliosis, a sideways curvature of the spine. So the rumour was partly true. Richard likely had one shoulder higher than the other, a torso that didn't sit perfectly straight. He might have been self-conscious. He might have had clothes tailored to disguise it. But he was not the shriveled creature propaganda invented. The skeleton suggests a man capable of fighting, someone who could, and did, die violently in battle. The consequences are a lesson in how royal reputation is manufactured. Richard's body became a canvas for his enemies' messaging, and people kept repeating it because it felt satisfying. Wicked king, wicked shape. The truth is subtler and therefore more unsettling. The crown doesn't just control land. It tries to control what you think a body means. And speaking of bodies being used as political proof, sometimes the body itself becomes a national emergency, like when a king's mind simply went away. Rumour 6. Henry VI's lost mind was real, and the kingdom watched him disappear. There are rumours that feel cruel to repeat, but history forces you to face them anyway. With Henry VI, people whispered that the king was not merely pious or gentle, he was mentally absent, that he stared, unresponsive, as if someone had switched him off. The setup is a fragile monarchy under pressure. Henry VI inherited the throne as an infant and grew into a man more suited to a monastery than a battlefield. England's losses in France, the constant factional feuding at court, and the strain of leadership built like water behind a dam. In 1453, the dam cracked. Contemporary accounts describe Henry suffering a severe mental collapse. He reportedly became unresponsive for months, unable to recognize people, unable to respond, unable to perform the basic functions of kingship. The rumour in the streets was that the king had gone mad. The pivot is that this wasn't partisan exaggeration. Official records and political actions confirm something was profoundly wrong. A protectorate was established, power shifted, and those around Henry treated the problem as real and ongoing. While historians debate the precise diagnosis, catatonia, severe depression, psychosis, or a complex hereditary issue, the fact of the breakdown is well supported. The consequences were catastrophic. A king's mind is not merely personal, it is the lock on the state. Once the lock failed, ambitious men tested the door. Rival claimants gathered supporters. The Wars of the Roses did not begin solely because Henry VI was ill, but his incapacity made the struggle easier to justify and harder to stop. And speaking of the brutal intimacy of monarchy, where the king's body, the king's mind, and the kingdom's future are all one tangled mess, wait until we reach the Tudors, where disgusting stops being metaphorical and becomes medical. Rumour 7. Henry VIII's leg really did rot, and the palace had to live with it. Henry VIII's image is all theatrical authority, broad shoulders, jewelled clothes, a stare that says the world is his. But beneath that costume, people at court whispered something far less regal, that the king's leg was foul, that it oozed, that it smelled, that the corridors of power carried the scent of infection. The setup begins with a life lived hard. Henry was athletic when young, obsessed with jousting, hunting, and proving himself physically dominant. In 1536, he suffered a serious jousting accident that left him injured and, crucially, less mobile. After that, his health declined in ways that were not easily hidden. Here's the pivot. This wasn't just mean gossip from enemies. Medical descriptions, ambassadorial reports, and later accounts converge on a grim reality. Henry developed chronic leg ulcers, likely worsened by poor circulation, weight gain, and repeated trauma. These weren't neat wounds you could bandage discreetly. Chronic ulcers can open, weep, close, and reopen. They can become infected. They can smell. They can make everyone around the patient quietly miserable. The disgusting truth is that a royal court, built around proximity to the king, had to manage the king's decaying flesh as part of politics. If you wanted favor, you stood near him. If you stood near him, you endured the reality of him. And the more pain he lived in, the more volatile he reportedly became, because chronic infection and constant discomfort don't produce calm decisions. The consequences were not only personal. Henry's paranoia sharpened. His punishments escalated. The atmosphere of fear thickened. A king in pain is still a king, except now he is a king who cannot be contradicted and cannot be soothed. And speaking of the Tudor court turning private bodily functions into national policy, next comes the rumour that the royal bedchamber wasn't romantic at all. It was an air-producing machine, and everybody knew it. Rumour 8. Henry VIII's private life was really a public fertility project. People often talk about Henry VIII's marriages as if they were love stories gone wrong. The rumour at the time was darker and more practical. The king treated women, queens, mistresses, potential brides, as instruments in a desperate campaign to produce a surviving male heir. The setup is a dynastic anxiety that bordered on obsession. Henry's father had seized stability after civil war, and Henry inherited a throne that still remembered chaos. A clear male succession wasn't a preference, it was presented as national security. The pivot is that the rumour was confirmed by Henry's own actions in Incan law. He did not merely divorce, he broke with the authority of Rome in England. He engineered a religious and political revolution. He annulled, married, annulled, executed, remarried, each time with the same grim logic humming underneath. Give me a son who lives. Even outside marriage, the court understood the stakes. Henry acknowledged at least one illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, which tells you something important. The king's fertility was a political asset, and proof of it mattered. The bedchamber was never simply personal. It was a workshop where the future of the realm was supposed to be manufactured. The consequences were devastating for the people caught in the machinery. Queens were praised when pregnant and discarded when not. Courtiers gambled on each new marriage like investors chasing the next bubble, and the state twisted itself around reproductive outcomes. Miscarriages became political events, menstrual cycles became whispered headlines, and private grief was repurposed into public suspicion. And speaking of suspicion, there's one Tudor rumour that started as cruel whispering around a woman's body and ended as a confirmed, heartbreaking reality. Rumour 9. Anne Boleyn's final pregnancy really did end in a miscarriage that changed everything. Before Anne Boleyn was executed, before the charges hardened into an official narrative, the court's gossip machine was already chewing on something intimate, that the Queen had lost a pregnancy, that it wasn't just a miscarriage, it was the kind of loss that made her position suddenly, terrifyingly unstable. The setup is the Tudor court at its most predatory. Anne's rise had been meteoric and controversial. Henry VIII had reshaped the world to marry her, which meant the world watched her for any sign she might fail him. In that environment, a pregnancy wasn't just a hope, it was a deadline. The rumour ran quickly. The Queen had miscarried, and worse, the child might have been a boy. people love to weaponize grief, and in a royal court, grief is never allowed to be private. If Anne failed to deliver a male heir, she became replaceable, especially with the king's attention already drifting. The pivot is that this isn't merely gossip preserved for drama. Historical records and contemporary accounts support that Anne suffered a miscarriage in early 1536, around the time Henry's interest in Jane Seymour intensified. Details about the fetus being male appear in later reporting and are discussed by historians with caution, because Tudor sources can be self-serving. But the key truth is firm enough. Anne lost a pregnancy at a critical moment, and the political oxygen around her disappeared. The consequences were immediate and merciless. Her enemies sensed blood in the water. The king's patience shortened. Within months, she was arrested, tried, and executed. Whatever the precise chain of motives, political convenience, personal desire, factional struggle, the miscarriage was one of the turning points that made the fall possible. And speaking of a woman's body becoming a national obsession, the next rumour is almost unbearable in its simplicity. A queen told the world she was pregnant, and her own body betrayed her. Rumour 10, Mary's pregnancy, was a phantom. The whole court had to pretend to believe Mary. I wanted something desperately ordinary, and for a monarch that made it dangerously political. She wanted a child, not a metaphorical heir, not a negotiated succession, an actual baby that would secure her Catholic restoration, and in her mind heal a lifetime of humiliation. The setup is personal and public at once. Mary had grown up watching her mother cast aside, her legitimacy questioned, and her status reshaped by the whims of her father. When she finally became queen in 1553, she was in her late 30s, already older than many royal brides had ever been expected to be. Her marriage to Philip of Spain was an alliance with enormous geopolitical weight, and it came with an expectation that she produced the next ruler. Then the rumour began to thicken into something the whole kingdom could smell. Mary was pregnant. She experienced symptoms consistent with pregnancy: cessation of menstruation, swelling, nausea, a growing belly. Court preparations began. Rooms were readied. Advisors planned for a regency if she died in childbirth. People prayed, and people panicked, and people positioned themselves for a future that suddenly felt tangible. Here's the pivot. There was no baby. Mary's pregnancy dragged on beyond the plausible timeline. The court became trapped in a performance where no one wanted to be the first to say the unsayable. Because how do you tell the Queen of England, who can order your downfall with a sentence, that the heir everyone is waiting for might not exist? Modern medicine offers explanations. Pseudocyesis, sometimes called phantom pregnancy, where intense desire, stress, and hormonal shifts can produce real physical signs, or other conditions such as ovarian cysts, tumours, or hormonal disorders. Historians can't diagnose her with certainty, but the brutal fact remains. The pregnancy was false, and the humiliation was public. The consequences were corrosive. Mary's authority did not collapse overnight, but the episode fed a narrative of tragedy and failure that her opponents used eagerly. It also deepened her desperation and sense of divine mission, because if you believe your body is a political instrument, then a malfunction isn't just medical, it feels like judgment. And speaking of judgment, Mary's reign is tied to another rumour that wasn't a rumour at all, but a policy people still remember, with a single grim nickname. Rumour 11. Bloody Mary wasn't just propaganda. The burnings were real and systematic. For centuries, people have argued about whether Mary deserved the name Bloody Mary, as if the cruelty might be a misunderstanding created by Protestant propaganda. The rumour, in its bluntest form, was that she burned people in bulk, that England smelled like charred wood and human flesh. The setup is a country in religious whiplash. Henry VIII had broken with Rome. Edward VI pushed Protestant reform further. Then Mary, a committed Catholic, came to the throne determined to reverse the tide. But religion at this level is never only about doctrine. It's about who gets to decide what truth is and what happens to those who disagree. The pivot is that the burnings are documented, Under Mary, hundreds of Protestants were executed for heresy, burned at the stake in public, deliberately staged as warnings. The exact numbers vary slightly by source and categorization, but the scale is not in dispute. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a sustained campaign carried out with legal process and public spectacle. The disgusting reality is not only the act itself, but the administrative calm around it. Warrants, trials, sermons, crowds gathering to watch. An entire civic ecosystem built around killing people for belief. Contemporary accounts describe the horror, the smell, the noise. And because burnings happen in public, they imprint themselves on memory in a way quieter executions do not. The consequences were political as much as moral. Rather than restoring Catholic unity, the burnings created Protestant martyrs and a narrative of suffering that later generations amplified. When Elizabeth of Ferrane succeeded Mary, she inherited not only the crown, but the emotional fallout of a nation that had watched neighbours die in fire. And speaking of Elizabeth, if Mary's body became a stage for phantom pregnancy, Elizabeth's body became a battlefield of rumour, surveillance, and control. Rumour 12, Elizabeth I's virginity was a political brand, not a verified fact. Elizabeth I became the Virgin Queen, a title that sounds like purity and devotion, but functioned like armour. The rumour mills of her time worked overtime. She was too close to Robert Dudley, she had secret lovers, she had secret children, she was secretly incapable of sex, she was secretly everything. The only way to survive that storm was to become the storm's author. The setup is a woman ruling alone in a world that insisted women should be ruled. Marriage negotiations were constant, international and predatory. Every prince or king who pursued Elizabeth wanted not just her hand, but control over England's future. If she married, she risked becoming a figurehead under a husband. If she didn't, she risked leaving no clear heir. The pivot is that her virginity is not something history can prove. What can be proven is the political strategy. Elizabeth consciously used ambiguity as leverage. She promised, delayed, flirted, teased, and refused. She positioned herself as married to the nation, unattainable and therefore sovereign. The rumour that she was a virgin became useful because it placed her above ordinary women, safely outside the messy realm of pregnancy and heirs that could be controlled by men. Contemporary observers argued both sides. Some insisted she was sexually active, others insisted she was not, and that uncertainty is the point. Elizabeth's private life became a public theatre where lack of proof was a tool. The consequences were long and strange. Her virgin brand helped her maintain control, but it also turned her into a magnet for grotesque speculation. People invent stories when they can't access fact. They always have. And the more she insisted on sacred distance, the more people tried to imagine what was hidden behind it. And speaking of what was hidden, there's an Elizabethan rumour so foul it sounds like an invention of enemies, that she used cosmetics made from poison and human remains. And yes, the ingredients were real. Rumour 13, Elizabeth I really did use cosmetics that could hurt her, including lead-based white makeup. The legend of Elizabeth's face, pale, smooth, almost mask-like, comes with a rumour that she painted herself with deadly substances. Enemies claimed vanity was eating her alive. The court whispered that her beauty routine was a kind of slow poisoning. The setup is the era's beauty standards and medical ignorance. Pale skin signalled wealth. You didn't labour outdoors. Women, and especially elite women, sought whiteness as status. After Elizabeth survived smallpox in 1562, her skin may have been scarred, and cosmetics became not just fashion, but camouflage. The pivot is that lead-based cosmetics were real and widely used. A famous product associated with the period, often called Venetian ceruse, contained white lead and vinegar, creating a bright, opaque paint. It could cover scars beautifully. It could also damage skin, cause hair loss, and led to long-term health problems. While historians debate how much Elizabeth used and how directly it contributed to her health decline, The practice itself is not a myth. The danger was built into the recipe. The disgusting part isn't only the chemical toxicity, it's the way beauty was treated as political necessity. Elizabeth's image wasn't personal vanity alone, it was statecraft. A queen's face was a symbol of stability and divine favour. If makeup helped maintain that illusion, then the risk was acceptable. The consequences were that court beauty culture became its own kind of arms race. If the queen did it, others followed. And in an environment where women were judged harshly for aging, a cosmetic that slowly ruined skin could become a trap. The more it damaged you, the more you needed it. And speaking of traps, the next rumour centres on a noblewoman whose death became a warning about how royal favour could turn lethal. Rumour 14. Amy Robsart's accident was always suspicious, and the basic facts really are that ugly few Tudor and Elizabethan rumours have the sticky, ominous feel of Amy Robsart's death. Amy was the wife of Robert Dudley, the man most closely associated with Elizabeth I's romantic rumour cloud. In 1560, Amy was found dead at the bottom of a staircase, her neck broken. The setup is what made the story explosive. Dudley was widely believed to be close to the Queen. If Amy conveniently died, Dudley could be available, and Elizabeth could marry him, at least in fantasy. The rumour erupted instantly. She was murdered. The pivot is that while historians still argue about what exactly happened, the suspicious basics are not invented. Amy died alone in unusual circumstances. An inquest concluded it was accidental. She fell downstairs, but contemporaries were not satisfied and the political implications were too obvious to ignore. If Dudley had any ambition, this death benefited him. If his enemies wanted to block him, this rumour was a perfect weapon. Modern analysis adds more uncomfortable possibilities. Illness, perhaps breast cancer, could have weakened her. A fall could have been real. Suicide has been proposed. Murder remains a contested idea. The truth is, we don't have a signed confession or a definitive forensic report. But the turned-out true aspect is that the death itself, and its convenient timing, and the court's immediate suspicion were all very real, and they shaped policy. Elizabeth, even if she loved Dudley, understood that marrying him would look like confirming the rumour, so she didn't. The consequences were political paralysis by scandal. Whether or not murder occurred, the rumour had power enough to kill a future. That's the monarchy's grim magic. Perception can become reality, and it doesn't need proof to destroy you. And speaking of destruction, when England's monarchy became entangled in civil war and execution, rumour stopped being gossip and turned into a kind of survival instinct. Rumour 15. Charles's court was so broke that royal luxury became a source of public hatred. Before Charles, I lost his head. He lost something quieter, the public's patience. A rumour ran through England that the king and his court lived lavishly, while the country strained under taxes, religious tension and political chaos. That the monarchy was an expensive aesthetic project. The setup is a reign defined by friction with Parliament and deep religious suspicion. Charles believed in divine right with a stubbornness that bordered on theological arrogance. At the same time, his court cultivated elaborate ceremony and expensive art. His patronage of painting and collecting was real and costly. The pivot is that the resentment wasn't baseless. Records of spending, court extravagance, and the visible culture of royal display fed a narrative of detachment. Even when the crown's finances were strained, the image of luxury persisted, and that image mattered. It wasn't just envy. It was a symbol of a monarch who seemed to prioritize his concept of kingship over the political compromise needed to keep the state functioning. The consequence was that when conflict escalated into war, people already had a moral framework for choosing sides. The king was not merely wrong, he was indulgent, arrogant, and out of touch. The rumour helped make revolution feel justified. And speaking of revolution, one of the most unsettling rumours about Charles I is not about money, but about the moment his life ended and what happened to the body afterward. Rumour 16. People really did collect relics from Charles I's execution including blood-soaked cloth. The execution of Charles III in 1649 was meant to be definitive. A king can be tried, condemned, and killed. The monarchy is not sacred. The state is not your personal inheritance. But humans are strange animals, and when you kill something symbolic, people respond symbolically. The rumour was that on the scaffold and afterward, onlookers soaked up the king's blood with cloth, dipped handkerchiefs, and kept fragments as relics. It sounds like medieval St. Cult behaviour transplanted into a supposedly more modern age. The pivot is that the behaviour is documented in contemporary accounts. Supporters treated Charles like a martyr almost immediately, and physical relics are the oldest technology of devotion. When a public execution occurs, the crowd becomes part of it, and the crowd takes souvenirs, sometimes because they hate the victim, sometimes because they worship him. The disgusting truth is the intimacy of it, blood as a keepsake, as a political statement, as a kind of portable miracle. Whether every story of relic collecting is accurate is hard to verify, but enough reports exist that historians treat the phenomenon as real. The consequences were long-lasting. The martyr king narrative helped royalists reframe defeat as sanctity. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, memory of Charles's death wasn't only political, it had been ritualized. And speaking of rituals, if you think relic collecting is unsettling, wait until you hear how Restoration court culture turned bodily appetite into entertainment. Rumour 17, Charles II's court really was that, sexually chaotic, and it wasn't just Puritan slander. The Restoration court under Charles II has a reputation that sounds like a tavern exaggeration. Endless mistresses, public affairs, and a king who treated fidelity as an optional accessory. Puritan critics certainly amplified the scandal, but the pivot is that you don't need Puritan imagination when the king himself was living like an advertisement for indulgence. The setup is a country emerging from civil war, republican rule, and strict moral governance. When Charles II returned, there was relief, celebration, and a hunger for pleasure after years of ideological discipline. Charles understood that atmosphere and leaned into it, cultivating a court where wit, theatre, and sensuality flourish. Mistresses were not hidden. Names like Barbara Villiers and Nell Gwynn became publicly known, their influence at court widely recognized. The king fathered multiple illegitimate children and acknowledged several, weaving them into the aristocratic fabric as if legitimacy was a technicality. The consequences were both cultural and political. The Restoration court became a symbol, either of joyful freedom or moral rot, depending on who was speaking. And because royal sexuality was never just personal, mistresses could become conduits for patronage, influence, and factional intrigue. And speaking of influence through intimacy, one rumour about Charles II is that he died in a haze of medical chaos, a royal body turned into a laboratory of bad ideas. And yes, it happened. Rumour 18, Charles II's deathbed treatment was a nightmare of bleeding, purging, and experimentation. When Charles II fell ill in 1685, the court did what courts always do in crisis. It performed urgency. Doctors were summoned. Treatments were applied rapidly and repeatedly. The rumour afterward was that the king was effectively tortured by medicine, bled, purged, blistered, dosed, and handled until his body gave up. The pivot is that medical records and descriptions of the treatments exist, and they are horrifying by modern standards. Physicians employed methods common at the time: bloodletting to balance humours, purgatives to cleanse, enemas, emetics, blistering agents, and complex mixtures that included substances we now recognise as dangerous. The disgusting reality is not that doctors were malicious, it's that they were confident. They believed they were helping. They believed illness was a system imbalance to be corrected by force, and when the patient is the king, no one dares suggest restraint. If anything, they intensify. More doctors arrive, more opinions demand action. A royal illness becomes a competitive display of intervention. The consequence is that the death of a king becomes a public lesson in the limits of authority. You can command armies, You can rewrite laws. You cannot command your own organs to cooperate. And you cannot command 17th century medicine to become competent simply because you are important. And speaking of incompetent systems surrounding royal bodies, let's move to a rumour about another monarch that sounds like slapstick, until you remember it involved actual human suffering. Rumour 19. The madness of George III was real enough to paralyse government for years. When people whispered that George III was mad, they weren't doing it for fun. They were doing it because the alternative was to admit something terrifying. The state was steered by a man whose mind could vanish without warning. The setup is a long-reigning monarch who became the symbol of stability until stability started slipping through his fingers. George III experienced episodes of severe illness, most famously in the late 1780s and again more permanently in the early 19th century. Courtiers reported frantic speech, agitation, insomnia, confusion, and periods where he seemed detached from reality. The rumour spread beyond court because the effects spread beyond court. Policy stalled, ministers manoeuvred. The question hung in the air like damp cloth. Who governs when the king cannot? The pivot is that this wasn't just opposition slander. Official actions confirm it. Parliament debated regency arrangements. Political factions treated the king's incapacity as a fact to plan around, not a joke to repeat. We also have medical notes and eyewitness descriptions that make clear something profound was happening, even if the exact diagnosis remains disputed. Some later writers argued for a metabolic condition like porphyria. Others propose psychiatric explanations such as bipolar disorder or other severe mood and cognitive disorders. The truth is, we cannot pin a modern label onto a royal body and call it certainty, but we can say the illness was real, recurring and consequential enough to reshape governance. And speaking of doctors, when a king collapses, medicine doesn't become kinder. It becomes louder, more invasive, and absolutely convinced it deserves to win. Rumour 20, George III was treated with restraints, blistering, and medical violence that sounds like punishment. If the rumour about George III's mind was grim, the rumour about how physicians handled it was worse. That the king was restrained like a dangerous animal, blistered, purged, and managed with methods that looked less like care and more like controlled brutality. The setup is 18th century medicine at its most confident and least effective. Doctors believed illness was a matter of imbalance, humours, vapours, overstimulation. So the cure often meant forcing the body back into line. And when the patient is the king, there's an extra layer of theatre. Every physician must be seen doing something, because doing nothing looks like incompetence. The pivot is that descriptions of George III's care include restraint and aggressive interventions that were normal for the era, especially in cases of severe mental disturbance. Accounts describe measures to limit movement, manage agitation, and calm him through methods that could easily worsen distress. Blistering, deliberately raising sores on the skin was used as a supposed diversion of illness. Bleeding and purging were common. The king's body became a battlefield where doctors fought the symptoms with force. The disgusting truth is that royal status doesn't protect you from bad medicine. It can actually guarantee more of it, because the more important you are, the more interventions pile on, the less anyone dares to question authority, and the easier it becomes to confuse suffering with treatment. The consequences were political and personal. A sick king endured invasive care, while the machinery of state shook around him. And speaking of royal bodies being managed by other people, there's an older court office that sounds like a crude rumour, but it was a real job with real influence, built entirely around the least glamorous part of being human. Rumour 21. Someone really did have the job of managing the king's toileting, and it could make you powerful. At some point, nearly everyone hears a joke that sounds like an insult. The king had a toilet servant. Surely that's just crude humour aimed at puncturing royal mystique. Except it's true. The setup is that monarchs didn't simply live, they performed, and performance requires logistics. In late medieval and early modern courts, there was an official role often known as the groom of the stool, tasked with assisting the monarch in the most private bodily moments. Yes, including toileting, along with managing personal items and access to the royal bedchamber. The pivot is where the disgust turns into something sharper, because the closer you are to the king physically, the closer you are politically. If you control access to the monarch when he is most unguarded, you become a gatekeeper. You hear private conversations, you receive confidential instructions, you become, in practice, a human lock on the door of power. This is documented in court records and household arrangements, not just in gossip. The job existed, the intimacy was real, and the influence could be enormous. People competed for proximity because proximity meant favour, and favour meant grants, offices and survival. The consequences are almost funny until they aren't. Royal culture tried to place the monarch above ordinary humanity, but it couldn't erase digestion. Instead, it built an institution around it, one that allowed bodily vulnerability to become political capital. And speaking of intimacy as power, now we reach a rumour about marriage that wasn't romantic or approved, but it did happen, and it haunted the monarchy for decades. Rumour 22. The Prince Regent really did secretly marry Maria Fitzherbert, even though it couldn't count. The rumour was irresistible. The Prince of Wales, heir to the throne, secretly married a Catholic widow. Not an arranged diplomatic match, not a polite royal bride. An actual love-driven scandal that broke every rule the monarchy used to keep itself tidy. The setup is George, Prince of Wales, later George III, living like a man allergic to restraint. He loved luxury, debt, drama, and the thrill of doing what he wasn't supposed to do. Maria Fitzherbert was older, Catholic, and socially unsuitable for the heir. The law mattered here, because royal marriages weren't just personal contracts, they were constitutional risks. Then comes the pivot. Evidence strongly supports that a marriage ceremony took place in 1785. Contemporary accounts, later admissions, and surviving documentation point toward a real, private commitment, real enough for the couple, real enough for society to tremble, but it couldn't be legally recognized. Under the Royal Marriages Act and laws restricting Catholic involvement in the succession, such a union created an impossible situation. A valid marriage could have shattered the prince's political future, so the arrangement lived in a limbo where it was emotionally real and legally nothing. The consequences were predictably nasty. The prince's debts and desire for public legitimacy pushed him toward an official marriage later, one that was famously miserable. Fitzherbert was left in a shadow status, both significant and officially erased. And speaking of miserable official marriages, few royal unions have produced such public disgust as the next one, where the spouse became a target to be controlled, exiled and humiliated on a national stage. Rumour 23. George Theo's body was held together by corsets, opiates, and sheer denial. The Prince Regent's image was supposed to be elegant, silk, jewels, ceremony, a living embodiment of glamour. The rumour underneath that costume was less glamorous, that he was physically collapsing, bloated with illness, sweating through perfumes, and kept functional through extreme tailoring and heavy medication. The setup is a man who ate, drank, and spent like consequences were for other people. Over time, George's weight increased dramatically. He developed chronic health problems, including severe pain and mobility issues. He also lived in an era where opiate-based medicines were common and often casually prescribed for everything from anxiety to agony. Here's the pivot. Accounts describe the elaborate measures used to present him. Corsetry for men was not unusual among elites, but in George's case it became essential architecture. Clothing wasn't merely fashion, it was structural support. There were reports of heavy sweating and strong scents used to mask the realities of the body beneath the finery. He was, in effect, curated like a monument that required maintenance. The disgusting truth isn't, "Ha-ha, fat king," because mockery is cheap. The truth is that monarchy encourages denial. A royal body is supposed to symbolize vigor and control even when it's failing. So the apparatus of court, tailors, servants, physicians worked to keep the symbol upright. The consequences were political in their own quiet way. A monarch struggling physically could become irritable, dependent, and insulated. And insulation, in a palace, is how bad decisions grow. And speaking of decisions driven by image and cruelty, the next rumour involves a queen who was treated like an embarrassment to be hidden, until she became a public cause and the monarchy looked frankly vicious. Rumour 24. Caroline of Brunswick really was publicly destroyed, and the state turned her marriage into a trial. Caroline of Brunswick became, in effect, the most famous unhappy wife in Britain, except her husband wasn't merely an unpleasant man. He was the heir, then the king, and the rumour was that he tried to erase her like a mistake. The setup is the arranged marriage between Caroline and George, Prince of Wales, in 1795. It was a political match meant to rescue his finances and stabilise appearances. The relationship was disastrous almost immediately. They separated, and Caroline's life became a tug-of-war between personal freedom and royal surveillance. The rumour that spread was vicious. Caroline was immoral, unfit, adulterous, that she kept improper company and behaved scandalously abroad. The monarchy's supporters treated her like a stain, but the pivot is that the crown didn't just whisper about her, it pursued her. When George became king in 1820, the government introduced proceedings that became known as the Queen Caroline Affair, attempting to strip her of her title through legislation and public accusation. Witnesses were gathered. Allegations were aired. The entire thing had the stench of a political hit job, and the public responded with fury, because even people who didn't adore Caroline could recognize a powerful man trying to crush a woman for being inconvenient. The consequences were humiliating and dramatic. Caroline was barred from the coronation. She died shortly after, her story absorbed into the national memory as a warning. Royal marriage can become a cage, and if you rattle the bars, the system may call you the problem. And speaking of women's bodies being treated as political property, let's return to the monarchy's favourite obsession: childbirth, heirs, and the dangerous inventions used to control pain. Rumour 25. Queen Victoria really did use chloroform in childbirth, and it shocked people who wanted women to suffer. The rumour ran through polite society with a tone of scandal. The Queen used anaesthesia during childbirth. She avoided the proper pain. Some people treated it like moral failure, because there has always been a faction that believes suffering is spiritually improving, especially when it's happening to someone else. The setup is Victorian Britain's mix of technological progress and moral rigidity. Anesthesia was emerging, but its use in childbirth was controversial. Religious critics argued that labour pain was divinely ordained. Medical conservatives worried about safety, and many simply felt that easing women's suffering was suspiciously indulgent. Then comes the pivot. Victoria did use chloroform for at least one of her later births, and she spoke positively about it in personal writings. This isn't a rumour floating unanchored. It's supported by accounts close to her and the broader historical record of royal medical practice. The disgusting truth is not the chloroform itself, it's the reaction. Even a queen, surrounded by doctors and privilege, had to step over a cultural belief that women should endure pain as a kind of moral tax. Victoria's decision helped normalise obstetric anaesthesia, not because society suddenly became compassionate, but because royal behaviour has a way of turning controversy into fashion. The consequences were quietly revolutionary. If the Queen could use anaesthesia and still be respectable, then the argument that pain was necessary began to sound like what it always was, a convenient tradition for people who weren't the ones screaming. And speaking of Victoria, there's a rumour about her grief that sounds like Gothic melodrama, until you realise it was daily routine for decades. Rumour 26. Victoria kept Albert's rooms preserved like a shrine, complete with daily hot water, as if he'd return when Prince Albert died in 1861. Victoria didn't merely mourn. She reorganized the world around his absence and demanded everyone else live inside it. The rumor was that she kept Albert's rooms exactly as he left them. Clothes laid out, personal items maintained, hot water brought daily as if he might need it. It sounds like a ghost story, a palace serving a dead man out of habit, superstition, or refusal to accept reality. The pivot is that the practice is documented enough to be treated as more than legend. Victoria's mourning became a central feature of her reign. She wore black for the rest of her life. Her household routines preserved Albert's presence with an intensity that unsettled observers. Servants were tasked with maintaining the physical environment of someone who was gone, turning grief into a schedule. The disgusting element here isn't mockery of sorrow. It's the way monarchy can transform private emotion into public architecture. A nation watched its ruler live beside a kind of curated absence, and that absence shaped politics. Victoria withdrew from public appearances for long periods, fueling Republican criticism and frustration. Her court became quieter, heavier, and haunted by a single story. The Queen was married to mourning. The consequences were cultural as much as personal. The Victorian tone, dark, solemn, reverent toward death, was reinforced by the monarch herself, not just by era stereotypes. When the ruler lives inside a shrine, the country absorbs the mood. And speaking of things the monarchy quietly passed down, sometimes what's inherited isn't a crown. It's a blood disorder, spreading through royal nurseries like a curse with paperwork. Rumour 27. The royal disease. Hemophilia really did enter European royalty through Victoria, and spread for years. People whispered that something was wrong with royal blood. Not morally, literally, that certain royal children bled too easily, bruised too deeply, died from injuries that should have been survivable. The setup is hemophilia, a genetic disorder affecting blood clotting, most commonly passed through carrier mothers to son. In the 19th century, nobody had the genetic framework to explain it properly, but they could see the pattern. Male heirs in powerful families dying young after minor accidents, hemorrhaging internally, fading in ways that looked like divine punishment if you were inclined towards superstition. The pivot is that the pattern in European royalty is real, and Victoria is widely identified as the source of the mutation entering several royal houses. Records of affected descendants, medical histories, and family lines support the conclusion that the mutation likely arose spontaneously with Victoria and then travelled through marriages into the royal families of Russia, Spain, and beyond. The disgusting truth is the cold arithmetic of dynasties. Royal marriage was a diplomatic network, and the network carried genes as efficiently as it carried treaties. When hemophilia appeared, it wasn't merely a medical problem. It became a political vulnerability. In Russia, the illness of the heir Alexei, linked through Victoria's descendants, contributed to the influence of mystics and the erosion of trust in the imperial family. One medical condition helped destabilize an empire already cracking. The consequences were a reminder that monarchy's obsession with bloodline is not poetic, it's biological, and biology does not care about crowns. And speaking of biology meeting scandal, Edwardian high society managed to drag the future king into a courtroom over cards, lies, and the kind of hypocrisy that always reeks worst when it's expensive. Rumour 28. Edward VII's private vices were public enough to end up in court, and everyone pretended to be shocked. Edward VII, before he was king, when he was simply Bertie, the Prince of Wales, was the kind of man rumours cling to without effort. Gambling, affairs, lavish parties, a social orbit where discretion was treated like an inconvenience. People whispered that the heir to the throne behaved like the rules were for the staff. The setup is late Victorian and Edwardian elite culture. Outward respectability, inward indulgence. The wealthy built social worlds where scandals could be smothered until they couldn't. One famous episode involved Baccarat, a card game associated with high-stakes gambling and questionable legality in private settings. The rumour was that cheating occurred at a grand gathering and that the Prince of Wales was present. The pivot is that the situation did become a legal spectacle. The Prince of Wales ended up involved in proceedings connected to the scandal, and the mere fact that the heir to the throne was dragged into such a mess confirmed what everyone already suspected. The boundary between royal dignity and private vice was mostly stage scenery. The disgusting element is the hypocrisy. Society often forgave elite men for behaviour it punished severely in anyone else. The prince's presence at questionable gatherings did not end his career. It didn't even seriously damage him long term. Instead, it became part of the unspoken social contract. The monarchy can indulge, and the public will be asked to pretend it's charming. The consequences were cultural. Edward VII's reign later took on the glow of Edwardian elegance, but that elegance had a sweaty underlayer. Gambling, affairs, and the constant effort to keep the royal image polished while the private life kept smearing fingerprints on it. And speaking of fingerprints, sometimes the truth doesn't surface as scandal in the moment. Sometimes it waits in a diary until decades later, quietly revealing that a king's final hours were helped along. Rumour 29. George V's doctor really did hasten his death with a lethal dose to control the headlines. This is the kind of rumour people tell in whispers because it makes authority feel cold, that a king didn't simply die, he was nudged out of life deliberately by his own physician for the sake of dignity and timing. The setup is King George V in January 1936, seriously ill and nearing the end. The royal household, doctors and family watched the slow approach of death, and with it came practical concerns, suffering, image, and the management of public news. The pivot is that a diary entry by his physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, later revealed that he administered a large dose of drugs, commonly described as morphine and cocaine, to hasten the end. The stated motive wasn't cruelty, it was control, to prevent a prolonged decline and to ensure the death could be announced in the morning papers with appropriate tone, rather than leaking out in a way that felt undignified. The disgusting reality is the calculation. It's not simply euthanasia as mercy, it's euthanasia tied to optics. The king's death became something to schedule, suffering became a variable to manage. Even if Dawson believed he was acting compassionately, the language of timing and headlines makes the act feel chillingly modern, like public relations creeping into the deathbed. The consequences were layered. Ethically, it raises questions still debated: consent, authority, and whether a doctor's duty can be bent by court expectations. Symbolically, it reveals something monarchy rarely admits out loud. Even death is curated. And speaking of curation, no royal image project in the 20th century was more frantic than the effort to make a king's political sympathies look harmless, even when they weren't. Rumour 30. Edward VIII's sympathy for Nazi Germany was real enough to alarm the British state. People like to reduce Edward VIII's story to romance, the king who gave up the crown for love. It's neat, cinematic and comforting. But another rumour ran alongside the love story, and it was far darker, that Edward's political instincts leaned disturbingly toward fascism, and that his friendliness toward Nazi Germany wasn't just naivete. The setup is a Europe sliding toward catastrophe in the 1930s, with propaganda, appeasement and political blindness infecting much of the establishment. Edward moved in elite circles where admiration for strong leadership sometimes outweighed moral clarity. After his abdication in 1936, he became Duke of Windsor, still royal, still famous, still potentially useful to enemies. The pivot is that concerns about Edward's sympathies were not invented by gossip columnists. Government anxiety was real, and wartime intelligence and diplomatic documents later fueled serious historical debate about his views and the risk he posed. His 1937 visit to Germany and interactions with Nazi leadership became a lasting stain. Historians argue about intent and degree, whether he was actively sympathetic, recklessly flattered, politically shallow, or dangerously willing to imagine himself as a bargaining chip. But the core truth remains uncomfortable. His behaviour and associations were alarming enough that the British establishment treated him as a potential liability. The disgusting reality is that royal status can function like a passport for bad judgment. A former king didn't have to be a strategic genius to be dangerous. He only had to be famous, suggestible, and placed where enemies could use him. The consequences were a quiet form of containment. Edward was sidelined, posted away, managed. The monarchy survived, but the fairy tale of abdication comes with this shadow. Sometimes the crown doesn't just fall. It has to be taken off for everyone's safety. So those are 30 royal rumours that weren't really just rumours, not in the comforting sense people mean when they want history to stay elegant. Some were confirmed by bones and bodies, some by diaries, medical notes, court proceedings, and the blunt paperwork of government. And some, perhaps the most unsettling, were confirmed simply by the way the system behaved when it thought nobody was looking. If there's a thread running through all of them, it's this. Monarchy sells the idea of a perfected human, polished into symbolism. A crowned body is meant to look ordained, composed, almost unreal, but the reality keeps leaking through the seam, through illness, childbirth, infection, addiction, grief, scandal, and the frantic, often cruel machinery built to hide those things. And notice who pays when the illusion starts to fail. Sometimes it's the person with the crown, strapped into bad medicine or curated into a mask. Sometimes it's the spouse who becomes a problem to be erased. Sometimes it's the public, forced to absorb propaganda while real decisions are made in private rooms that smell of sweat, perfume, and fear. The rumour is rarely just entertainment. It's a way for ordinary people to describe power when power refuses to explain itself. The darkest joke is that the monarchy, for all its obsession with lineage and purity and ceremony, can't escape the most ordinary truths. Bodies decay, minds break, love complicates loyalty, pain makes people cruel, and history, patient, nosy, and unromantic, keeps finding the receipts. If you want, we can do another set, more medieval, more Tudor, more modern, or focused on one dynasty until the details start to feel uncomfortably close. For now, let the palace lights dim, let the gossip fade into the soft hum of time, and remember, the crown doesn't remove humanity, it just forces humanity to perform, sometimes grotesquely, on a stage big enough for everyone to watch.